mining and metals drives everything in the world economy. Once a student learns anything about the mining industry, they become absolutely obsessed. To attract talent to this industry, it has to come from a place of passion, awareness, understanding that this is probably more important than building a better meta Instagram algorithm to suck people's eyes onto their screen for 23 more minutes per day.
Welcome to another episode of Ore-atory. Today I have Daniel Rao at Kunin with me. Welcome, Daniel.
Good to see you, Lindsey. Pleasure to be on the show.
Well, I can't wait to talk a bit more about what you're doing. But let's start at the beginning. How did you end up in mining and what's making you stay?
I think I got here by accident, which is probably a similar story to most people, given that there hasn't been a lot of recruiting or focus in the mining industry in this country for several decades. So I studied chemical engineering at Vanderbilt University School in Nashville, Tennessee. And so naturally the skill set match was there from the get-go. But I originally worked in the energy transition and various technologies within it. So first it was hydrogen fuel cell membrane research, which has a full circle moment to what Kunin is doing today. And loved the nature of the research. And I put myself in that bucket kind of to one up my brother, who was a commodity trader. And I looked at all the cool stuff he was doing, albeit in oil and gas, and saying, I want to do something more technical. I'd rather work on a technology that might be changing the world for the better, although I've matured in that respect with understanding the energy supply chains. So I was in hydrogen. I started asking too many economic questions surrounding fuel cells, electrolyzers, whether or not green hydrogen had a dollar per kilowatt basis, a dollar per kilowatt hour basis that made economic sense to invest in. And mind you, this was the height of the zero interest rate period, venture capital investment bubble, where a lot of things were getting funded that shouldn't have been funded. Things, fringe technologies around direct air capture, grid, et cetera. So I did a project for Volvo as part of a school course at Vanderbilt, where I essentially did this whole economic analysis on hydrogen fuel cell trucks and whether they could replace battery electric vehicle trucks or diesel engine trucks, and unequivocally came to the answer that there was really no path to viability. There were certain assumptions in all these models that executives or business leaders had made at Volvo that directly contradicted all the data I was getting in the lab working on the cutting edge of this technology. And so for me, that was certainly an inflection point where I knew I wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to focus on a certain technology industry, but I had to be very careful that I worked on the right problems and ones that had permanence and economic relevance. So I pushed myself then to explore elsewhere. And it initially was not mining as an industry, but it was oil and gas. So I worked for a small mid-cap oil and gas company in one of my semesters at Vanderbilt called Delic US, and joined as an intern on the corporate ventures team. And they had about $100 million AUM fund. And similarly, we're investing in a lot of energy transition technologies. And that was an amazing learning experience for me as an engineer. But the first few projects were biofuels, synthetic aviation fuels, direct air capture, and did the work, loved it, learned a lot, but similarly asked these economic questions that did not have strong answers to. And so towards the end of that, I asked them, can I work on something else? And the something else they put me on was actually the first taste of the mining industry, or rather brine industry, which is adjacent to mining, that I ever had. And that was to look at direct lithium extraction from some oil and gas wells in southern Arkansas. And so lithium, of course, had its price run in 2022 to 2023. And since that point, a lot of oil and gas majors have entered the space: Exxon, Chevron, Equinor. And this smaller oil and gas company similarly wanted to evaluate and pursue. So I did this whole case study and analysis on them, on their assets, about the economic viability. And I fell in love with metal at that point, which then led me to mining as a whole. And I was fascinated for a few reasons. It was understanding that all of these battery metals consistently require a real cost basis decline over the next many decades if we wanted to achieve all these decarbonization goals and grid electrification goals. And so we needed to mine more metals. We needed to mine them cheaper. And it was not relying on subsidies or tax credits. So as an engineer, a hopeful engineer trying to select an industry upon graduation, there's a little bit more job security in that respect. So I was over the moon. I was in love. Brine processing, mineral processing, of course, is a chemical engineer's bread and butter. So from that internship forward, I was doing an engineering consulting internship over the summer, and I pushed them to put me on battery recycling projects, which of course had its heyday in investment community in 2023, 2024 with the likes of Lifecycle, Redwood, Ascend Elements, and was trying to inch closer and closer to a mining company. And thankfully, through my brother's network at Tulane University, he connected me with an alum who was at a company called Livent, which eventually merged with Allchem to become Arcadium Lithium, and then most recently was acquired by Rio Tinto to be Rio Tinto Lithium's business unit. And so had a wonderful conversation with a man named Ashish Patki, who became an enormous mentor of mine, a chemical engineer who had worked at Exxon and then moved to a commercial function short into his career. And essentially put my best foot forward and told him very directly, I'd love to work in the lithium industry. Is there a role here? And he had taken on MBAs and students from Tulane to work in market intelligence internships and commercial roles. And I'd done my studying, mind you, as well, starting to consume podcasts in the lithium industry and the mining industry, podcasts such as Money of Mine, Howard and Rodney with RK Equities, and Joe Lowry's Global Lithium podcast. So did as much homework as I could, and I guess that was recognized, and I was blessed with the opportunity to work for Arcadium Lithium / Livent in my last year of studying chemical engineering at Vanderbilt. And that's where the mining insanity began. I always made a joke to my friends. I caught this disease or bug during my senior year. Wasn't as social, didn't have as much free time to spend outside of work, and I called this bug lithiitis, and simply just gotten absolutely enthralled with the industry. And so every waking minute and hour was spent listening to podcasts, cracking open 10Ks, 10Qs, learning about the market, the supply and demand. And specifically at Arcadium Lithium and / Livent, I was in a market intelligence role helping the commercial team, Ashish, the CSO, CFO, CCO, building some presentations, some models for them surrounding some of Livent's specialty lithium chemical portfolio. And then as much as I could, trying to be a sponge to learn about the salts market, which feeds into lithium-ion battery manufacturing. And so worked for Arcadium Lithium for the whole senior year of university. And as delusional as I am, I wanted to put more on my plate. So I did my senior design project for a battery recycling company called Ascend Elements. And I had found my calling, and I was going to go be a process engineer in the lithium industry, potentially get shipped off to Argentina or Australia. But then a professor at my university invented a direct lithium extraction technology. And I can talk about that more if you're curious, Lindsey, but that's what spurred me down this entrepreneurial pathway that now has led me to build Kunin.
That is I would say an accelerated version of a career path, right? So you really identified a lot of technical routes that led you to where you are today. I find it really fascinating because I think a lot of people take 5 or 10 or even more years than that to really say, this is what I want to do and I'm passionate about it. And I think it's funny that you say about lithiumitis. What would you call it?
Lithiitis.
Lithiitis. There we go. Because I call it the mining bug all the time. I tell students that we visit with, I tell entry professionals to the mining industry, like, when you find the people or the technology or the skill set that just lights you up, like, you wind up just getting the mining bug and you're here to stay. And I'm glad that you found lithiitis and that you're here and that we get to have this conversation, because I'm infinitely curious as to, because this is just a few years of time, right? How old are you? You don't mind my asking?
Never ask a man that question. I'm 23.
So I just find it absolutely incredible that you've identified this, that you've done as much research, and that you now have developed Kunin, which I would love to hear the origin story of Kunin. So you worked with this individual, Arcadium, and so that sort of then gave the spark, or you launched off into Kunin. How? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the battery recycling capstone projects and the commercial work I did at Arcadium Lithium. It helped me understand this technology cost structure, cost curve problem that was prescient in the lithium supply chain. So on the commercial side with Arcadium Lithium, they were the first people to commercialize direct lithium extraction, which mind you is just a buzzword for investors. It's somewhat mature unit operations or technologies deployed for selective extraction of lithium. And so they have all these amazing brine projects in South America. They've got some great resources, which they would like to expand. And the case of Arcadium Lithium is one in which they were kind of America's lithium company and then failed to expand through down cycles and up cycles, while Chinese mining companies had actively acquired assets, developed them, and put them lower and lower on the cost curve. So understanding where lithium price point was and understanding the cost structure of lithium extraction, it became very clear that one of China's superpowers, Gongfen and all these other companies, was their ability to offer process technology at a lower total installed cost and lower the capital intensity of developing the same brine assets that Arcadium might be looking at or Albemarle might be looking at. But for example, with half the capital intensity and then that financial math flowing through to actual development. So that commercial perspective was stuck in my head. I would ask maybe naive questions or stupid questions. Why? Tell me about the tech, etc. And then when I did my capstone project for Ascend Elements, battery recycling, of course, is deploying mature unit operations, but there's some novel process development that has to go on. And so these are technologies you might hear about in the copper industry or earth industry. It's all the same, but just different chemistry for different metals. And that's solvent extraction, ion exchange, adsorption, precipitation. So as I got more familiar with the actual unit operations and understanding all the DCF math when you break down investing in an asset, it became very clear that there was somewhat of a disadvantage with Western technology vendors and providers. They weren't offering as cost competitive of solutions, and this was flowing through to some assets are not getting invested by Western mining companies. So then this seeded this thought of, that's a problem, I'd like to fix it. And I think you broadly see this across the traditional tech or venture industry of younger people not having any preconceived notions on how things should be done, getting frustrated that there's just this status quo that seems like an immovable object. And so that's what got me curious about what other options are there, what other technologies are there. And so midway through this sort of enlightening in the last semester or two of my undergrad, a Vanderbilt professor I'd taken a graduate level coursework with named Dr. Shihong Lin approached me. And funny enough, in that graduate level course, I would say I wasn't the best of students. And that was because I was working on that lithium, that DLE analysis for the oil and gas company during every class. He approached me and said, I've invented a new lithium extraction technology. I know you're in the industry, trying to get into the industry further. Can you give me some advice with grant proposals? So I started helping him. One conversation led to another. We eventually filed some grant applications together. And I suppose he was impressed with my understanding of the industry at a young age. And I'll never forget this moment, but he essentially said, wow, this is impressive. You're impressive. We should start a company and you should lead it. And at that point in time, that was quite shocking to hear. It was certainly a big vote of confidence. And we then started to discuss what that might look like. So the last semester of school was filled with juggling the internship, the senior project, and then preparing to commercialize the professor's technology. And so this involved conversations with the technology transfer office at my university, doing entrepreneurial programs at Vanderbilt, applying to some grant programs through the U.S. National Science Foundation. And the future was a little bit unclear or opaque and really didn't crystallize until April, May. So that final month of my degree, where we won a grant program called the NSF Innovation Core Program. And that's simply $50,000 to give technology or university invented technology and their startup teams $50,000 to go talk to people in industry, travel to conferences, talk to these decision makers, the engineers, operators at assets to understand whether this technology is actually solving a problem, which is very important. Sometimes you find you build a hammer and look for the nail, and that's certainly not the right way to approach building a company. And so to be clear, that technology from Vanderbilt is not what Kunin is doing today, but all of the lessons learned from that process enabled me to, I think, what we have is building the right hammer to hit any nail. So I graduated, spent my time in Nashville, post-graduation, working in the lab with a professor, going through this program, ended up talking to probably hundreds of process engineers across the lithium industry in many continents. And funny enough, another full circle here is one of those original engineers has now joined Kunin as of today as our VP.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So graduated Vanderbilt, 3-4 months in that program, still not very clear what the path forward was with the professor's technology. But then SQM and their corporate venture capital team, I met them in late July, and they essentially said, you should certainly apply to our accelerator program, which gives $25,000 of non-dilutive financing. This lithium extraction concept is very interesting. There's maybe applications that are assets. And so I enrolled in that program, received a lot of mentorship from process engineers and commercial folks out at SQM and throughout Chile. And that culminated with a visit to Santiago de Chile in late November to go give a demo presentation to the SQM team at a big conference in the middle of the city. So I got all prepared for that. The technology was still immature, still at the bench scale in the lab. Still needed maybe a little bit more work before you could go to investors and raise capital to try to scale. But that was certainly a path forward. But I found out about one day before the pitch competition or pitch presentation that we essentially didn't have freedom to operate to commercialize that technology, and that another US company and research group had done their homework and filed their patents with great IP lawyers about 9 months before we had gotten to this concept. And so it appeared that there was no path forward. This happened November 2024. And then I started to think, do I go to industry as a process engineer, or do I take the little bit of capital and lot of learnings that I have about the various process technologies and how technology is commercialized into mining assets, and using this metaphor again, maybe build a better hammer, a very good hammer, to try to solve this cost structure issue with several battery metals and critical metals. And so was floating around for 3-4 weeks, and then came up with the concept for Kunin, and that eventually led me to the West Coast to raise venture capital. And now we're back out here in Chattanooga about 12 months later, an amazing team of 6 working very hard to get towards pilot opportunities, some exciting technical progress.
That's a really fun story, and I love that it's come full circle a few times, actually. So let's talk about Kunin. What does Kunin do?
The simple one line is that we help mines make more metals. And we could maybe end the podcast right there. Maybe that, and get hundreds of people and they're really in the end. Yeah.
They're like, wait, this is exactly what we need.
So I'll shy away from some of the technical details right now, but what I observed in the lithium industry, specifically for lithium extraction, was that there was a Chinese equipment solution company called Sunresin that was offering some amazingly low cost equipment into the direct lithium extraction industry, all focused on a core technology called ion exchange. And they make these ion exchange materials, they develop the process technology, and then they're so vertically integrated that they also give EPCM services to install this at various assets. And they've got an amazing track record at Chinese mining assets, as well as maybe bidding and winning on some of these brine projects in South America. And this was a frequent concern in the lithium industry, that Sunresin's technology was simply better or lower cost and no one could compete. And as I learned more and more about Sunresin, it became evident that they were also developing these solutions for gallium extraction, scandium, indium, certain rare earth elements, gold, silver, essentially the whole periodic table. And ion exchange as a technology is applicable to about half of the periodic table. And they all chase this key performance indicator, which is directly tied to the overall cost of the solution, which is trying to shrink the footprint and use the least amount of ion exchange resin material as possible. And I'd gone into some of the weeds and math and physics and did some simulations as to why. And the full circle moment came in with some of the hydrogen fuel cell membrane work that I had done, that maybe this core ion exchange technology can be pushed to a higher performance frontier limit. And so I filed a bunch of IP. We did the West Coast move. By we, I mean it was just I, and then we successfully raised our pre-seed venture capital round. And with this core technology, what we think we can do, and what we're starting to demonstrate in the lab, is that we can shrink the footprint of ion exchange process technology even further and offer it near an order of magnitude lower capital intensity with some unit OpEx gains, consumable consumption gains, also demonstrated in an EPCM case study and pilot, hopefully later in the year. So that's the core technology and value proposition. And as I grew out of the lithium industry and learned about other metal markets through conferences such as PDAC, some networks through X.com, meeting mining entrepreneurs, it became abundantly clear that if this were to be true, that you can make ion exchange substantially cheaper, that this would provide some enormous value proposition or economic value to a lot of other metals on the periodic table. And so I started researching into a lot of these minor metals that are feeding semiconductors, rare earth elements, and magnets, grid electrification, et cetera, and noticed that they're almost always recovered as byproducts from operating assets that might be producing a primary base metal or PGM. And when you go to the specifics of these processes, it's often recovered using ion exchange and then one other unit operation downstream. And so then I got very curious about, let's break down the DCF math. If you made ion exchange substantially cheaper and you saw how this affected the process, the downstream and upstream, and you tried to tie that all into total capital invested, unit OpEx, and do all that financial math down on the back end, if what I believe we can do becomes true, you substantially move the economic viability and investability of these byproducts. And this is the very technical, nerdy way to say Kunin helps mines make more metal, and it's because our technology is unlocking the viability of recovering byproducts. And we'd hope to do this at several dozens, hundreds of mining assets across North America and the United States. And there's no more important time to do that than now with current geopolitical tensions rising. And so coincidentally, SunResin's process technology is export restricted. That's a footnote most people don't read into when they see yttrium or gallium is now export restricted. And we're trying to become the SunResin of the West and focus exclusively on byproduct production. And this can fall into 3 or 4 different buckets at an operating asset level in terms of feedstocks or where we fit in with the technology. But overarchingly, we want to become the SunResin of the West, unlock the viability of all these byproducts. And funny enough, I don't think there's any other point in time in the past 20, 30 years where building this company could be possible, where capital is now legible to mining technology. There's an impetus to recover a lot of these metals. And so we have this core technology. We've got an amazing team of 6 engineers now, and that's what we do.
I love it. And I think that you mentioned earlier as we were chatting that you came at this with sort of fresh eyes and perhaps without being jaded. And I think that's a really important place to come from. And sitting where I am as a recruiter and looking at assets, people throughout the mining industry, it's an interesting thing to watch, right? Because in talking to entry level and younger professionals with really great ideas and such sort of exuberance and coming into it and then watching what happens over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, it really can be a deflating scenario. And so I think you've created a situation where you have, one, made a viable solution and then created a company around it. Maybe in 5 or 10 years from now, won't have to have the conversation with you where you're feeling defeated and deflated because no one's told you, no, we can't do that, or no, it's not done this way. And I'm sure you're hearing that still, but you get to protect that in a way that I don't see a lot of other people manage well.
Thank you. I would have to say, though, it's not always been sunshine and roses building Kunin. A lot of up and downs, and that's something you simply have to learn to deal with and manage if you're psychotic enough to try to start a company. It's almost every other week that you have an enormous high and then a depressing low, and it's inevitable.
Resilience, I think, is very important, and no better way to figure that out than being an entrepreneur, I have found myself. But I think I always love talking to people who have created companies from a technical background and then come into it and say, man, there were so many things I just didn't know. And as you've discovered, what are some of the most enjoyable things that you get to do as being an entrepreneur? And then what are some of the things that you could just do without? Let's talk about the good parts first.
I could do with more sleep, that's for certain.
I understand.
The cortisol is certainly high. The things that I love, and I never expected this when I started the company, one of the most gratifying things is understanding that you're giving people not only gainful employment, but have galvanized them to work on a technology. And in our case, a lot of the hires have thought about this concept or observed a paper maybe 20 years ago on this concept and asked the question, why is no one doing this? And so for them, it's a technical life calling. But the fact that you're giving people gainful employment and galvanizing them to work 80, 90 hours a week in some cases is very shocking, especially for someone so early in my career. That makes me so proud. In some ways, I feel like a father, although I'm certainly not a father yet. That's been the most enjoyable moment, is actually seeing people band together and work together, because I don't know, you never realize work can feel like family in some respects, or be so.
Especially as you're building a company, right? And so it's one of my favorite stages of organization to work with is a founder and then say, okay, we need to add to this team. And this is my vision for what it looks like. And then watching that evolution, right? Because every person that you add at this stage changes the culture, changes the outcome, changes every way that things are being done. And so having that almost familial scenario where you can work really hard and learn to agree or disagree is so important to your future success. And so it's just such a fun stage to be a part of, I'm sure, from this being an idea to watching it become more of a reality. And I'm sure that helps the team really find the energy to work as hard as they are. And so what a treat, right?
Yes, of course. And it's a high that I think, or I would hope, never goes away as we grow the team, raise more capital, get equipment in the field, have to think about hiring people to operate equipment, some of the manufacturing here on the resin side. Yeah.
Oh, there's always the other side of entrepreneurship. What part would you give away if you could?
Having to work with equipment vendors and niche chemical suppliers and operate through email. I'm the sort of person that would much rather just get on the phone and then maybe fly to go meet you and sort it in 2 days rather than 2 weeks or 2 months. Yeah. And dealing with that is something I'd never had to do previously. There's no way we can solve or throw that away. It's just the reality of trying to build a company.
Yeah.
Also having to explain the mining industry to some fresh eyes, especially the investment community that is now kind of rigorously trying to find and invest in technologies here. That's been a process, but hopefully podcasts such as these with Kunin, we plan to do some more media to educate people about the iron exchange resin industry and processing industry. That becomes a little bit easier.
So one of the other areas that you mentioned that I'd like to go a bit further into is this is prime time. We've got an audience in the mining industry and processing specifically, I think, to secure some domestic supply with all of the geopolitical scenarios that are happening at the present time. And what an opportunity for you to really be launching into this. But you just mentioned we've got uneducated capital coming in. And so that breeds a whole different kind of conversation that has to be had to educate them. How long does it take? What does this look like? How does this work generally? And so there's opportunity and challenge. And with that, I think you render a different kind of results, but I'm sure you're having some really interesting conversations. And I just think I have been part of the industry now for close to 22 years. And I've talked to people across the spectrum, trying to university students saying, hey, mining is a very viable option over the short and long term. And that's fallen on deaf ears. And I think it's a really exciting thing to say, I have a technology that can solve all of these problems. Do you foresee yourself being an ambassador or an advocate for the mining industry with college students or others? Because I think you would be a great person to do it with what you're up to and your sort of trajectory into the industry and what you're seeing on a daily basis.
Of course, I'd love to, Lindsey. Maybe you're the person that can tell me how to become that ambassador. So I was recently I was recently at SME, and of course, I've made some amazing friends across the EPCMs of the world in the mining industry, the large mining companies. And they actually had observed that in the past 2, 3 years, attendance of students to SME as an event has maybe increased even an order of magnitude upon what it was just a decade ago. And that's really juxtaposed across declining enrollments and graduation rates overall in the mining industry. And there's some statistic there that I believe China outstrips US graduates in the mineral processing industry by, I think, an order 30 to 50. So you're right, there's this renewed interest as people understand that mining and metals drives everything in the world economy. And certainly semiconductors, robotics are going to need a crap ton of rare earth elements, gallium, germanium, et cetera. This is something I'm very passionate to do. I don't really know where to start, but in my past, I did start a club at Vanderbilt called the Energy Transition Society before I caught this lithiitis bug, and had tried to actively rope students to go look at hydrogen, direct air capture, et cetera. And one of my complaints to my alma mater, whom I love, was that there didn't seem to be a very cohesive recruiting pipeline for chemical engineering students at Vanderbilt into the ExxonMobils of the world. And that was sorely lacking and disappointing because, like many students who might even listen to this show, I was someone at 19, 20 years old that really didn't know what I wanted to do with my degree. Chemical engineering was somewhat of a flippant choice. I was good at math, I was good at physics, I was good at chemistry in high school. Crystallizing a purpose, a burning passion to solve some problem was certainly not there until I figured we got a kick in the ass that I need to work really hard to achieve something. Kudos to my father. So I didn't know what to do. And despite all the progress I've made in the past 2, 3 years, and now being blessed to run a startup that might change the world, that inflection point didn't happen until I was about 21 years old. And so my sister is a chemical engineering student who's 21 and in her last junior semester of school. And she's now panicking about what she wants to do. And I told her 2.5, 3 years ago, I was in your shoes and I had no clue what I wanted to do. And look at me now. And so I actually brought her to SME, which occurred about 3, 4 weeks ago. And she was nervous. She hadn't gone to a conference before and knew no one in the mining industry, but I made her jump off the deep end, come a day before I arrived, and just walk the conference floor. And by the time I'd gotten to the conference, she was head over heels obsessed with this industry. And
we got her the bug.
Wants to work. And I think by the time this podcast is released, hopefully she has an opportunity to go work on some process technology. But I only give that anecdote to give example to the fact that once a student learns anything about the mining industry, they become absolutely obsessed, and rightly. And so mining overall it simply does have this communication and imaging problem, and it's viewed as dirty. You could argue that's from the media or environmentalist groups, despite mining having an amazing track record in Western countries of environmental safety, managing tailings appropriately, low injury rates. And so I think the mining companies are simply a little shy with the quote unquote propaganda and recruiting, right? Why is it the case that nuclear power or clean energy can be appeared as so sexy in the Wall Street Journal, but you don't have Barrick, Newmont, Rio, or BHP going out there and talking about how important copper is outside of reporting to shareholders? So I think overall the mining industry can improve. I've even had thoughts insofar as restarting the U.S. Bureau of Mines. There's rumblings of that with people in the SME community in Washington, D.C. I believe that certainly needs to happen. Scholarships, grants towards students studying in this industry needs to be promoted. There's all these jumbles of ideas, Lindsey, and I think podcasts such as these, getting to meet more people, trying to raise their voice is exactly how it starts. And then hopefully quickly all at once, we see an enormous spike of students now pursuing degrees.
We're starting to see an increase in students very slowly. And I'm starting to see a few more universities add mining related concentrations. We still don't have the numbers that we're going to need. I think the average that what we're looking at statistically is 120 people graduating out of mighty universities a year. That doesn't mean that's all we wind up with, right? Vanderbilt is not technically a mining university.
No, not at all.
We've had the University of Georgia, we've got geologists coming out of there, we've got earth sciences. But the thing is, it's not just STEM majors, right? So we have people from all different backgrounds and educations that need to contribute to the mining industry. And I think there's been a real dearth. And coming from a reformed HR person, this is something that I think we need to go and talk to business majors about and say, hey, we need somebody to deal with all the HR stuff. We need somebody to do the accounting. It's very different. And they get the bug too. And so there's lots of opportunity for students to get involved. And I think that it comes across potentially a bit disingenuous when we're 20 to 30 to 40 years in our career and we go to university and then pull them into it and then tell them no all the time. And that's when I say we beat the enthusiasm out of them, but try to encourage them to come. And so I like the idea of having more entry level people go try to recruit, tell the stories, keep that level of enthusiasm up, because we're going to have a big changing of the guard. We have what we refer to as the gray tsunami, right? So 55% of our workforce is over the age of 55. So we're going to see those individuals trail out of the industry pretty quickly, honestly. And so there's a huge gap between those individuals and then where you sit. So we're going to have to make up that gap with technology, with people that are accelerating their careers like you have, that can step into leadership and senior level positions and then backfill the rest of that. And with what we are facing, I think, in the US for securing domestic supply and figuring out how to do more with less environmental impact and all the rest of it, there's a lot of really cool ideas that we can use students and entry-level professionals to push along. And there's no better demographic than to say solve some big problems and have an impact. But I guess my next soapbox moment, as I've been talking for 10 minutes now, is that the mining companies do a really poor job of saying why they're doing what they're doing. And you alluded to this because we're so used to talking to investors and to one another. There is no value proposition for students to go look at a Rio Tinto website. They're going to look at it and say, we're getting copper and other metals for what? What do they do? What are they part of? Why should I do this? And I think that we're doing this backwards. We need to talk about the why versus the we need investment and this is where we're doing it, et cetera. Talking to one another is getting us no further. We need to talk beyond the silo of what we are today. So into soapbox Moe.
Wasn't a soapbox, Lindsey. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's very little understanding from any consumer in this country that their iPhone right here has maybe 37 metals in it. I actually played this game at PDAC with a friend who had a wireless charge, not a wireless charging, a charging pack that they were putting in their breast pocket to make sure their phone didn't die. And we played a game where we took a photo of the charging pack with AI, and I asked it how many metals are in this, and we went around and had people try to guess. But you'd never believe that maybe even just these headphones have 8 different metals in it. And this is a menial, meaningless consumer product, but no one understands that the electric vehicle that they want to buy has hundreds of kilograms of copper in the wiring harnessing, and the battery has nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And so despite being 4 or 5 orders or degrees of separation removed from primary mining at Bingham Canyon and smelting at Kennecott, the mining companies, I think, need to make that very clear. And you weirdly observe that in Silicon Valley and these tech companies, that there's so much marketing around AI and companies invest significantly into media or PR. There's sometimes chief communication officers that were brand designers for their whole career. I'd like to see something similar from the mining companies, be more active on socials, because whether for good or for worse, this generation is certainly consuming all of their information from social media platforms, and those channels need to be tapped in. So I don't know, maybe we're being sycophantic here and not actually talking about direct solutions, but you just need more across the board.
You took your sister to SME, and I think that is an actionable thing that more of us can do, right? And so even though edging towards a degree that will be highly useful in our industry, I would argue that almost any degree could be highly useful in our industry, technical or non-technical, because we have nurses, we have doctors, we have pilots, we have camp cooks. So you just have to orient them to what's going on and why it's necessary. And I think the problem that you also said, it was like, I was at a point in my university experience where I didn't know what I wanted to do. That's what professionals need to get involved and say, this is what a day looks like. These are all the
Yeah.
things that you might have the opportunity to do and to think about, because you don't know what you don't know, especially at that part of life. And you live in this ecosystem where it's study and books and friends and whatever other things, but you don't know to consider something that's never been presented to you. And from an actionable scenario, I think people should just go develop relationships with universities that they've been a part of and say, how can I help? Can I come and talk to your class? Whatever that might look like, because otherwise we do not have the pipeline that we're going to be needing. So that's perhaps more a solution than just talking in circles today.
Of course. Kudos to you with University of Georgia then, Lindsey. I certainly would like to be doing that as well, although I'm very busy.
You're running out of time, right?
I'm running out of time. You made a good point that maybe there needs to be the day in the life TikTok of Kennecott or Bingham Canyon, because there is this preconceived notion among students that mining means a pickaxe, mining means I get coal in my lungs, mining means I might cut off my finger, but that is, of course, is further from the case. And so a lot of them don't know that mining can be somewhat comfortable of a career, that you might actually be working for an EPCM doing process design and studies rather than pouring mercury on gold and amalgamating it and having health risks. So yeah, that needs to become more clear. And one of the practical realities though with recruiting into the mining industry is that you can't force people with a stick. Of course, you'd never do that in Western countries. So the carrot needs to be quite large. And I could go on a rant overarchingly about the US economy and incentive structures, but it's simply more lucrative and attractive to trade at drain streets and be a quantitative trader or work as a software engineer for OpenAI than it is to be a process engineer solving real problems and working in the productive industries. So I don't actually see a way in which that would ever be flipped. And so to attract talent to this industry, it has to come from a place of passion, awareness, understanding that this is probably more important than building a better meta Instagram algorithm to suck people's eyes onto their screen for 23 more minutes per day. So on that note, let me know how I can help, Lindsey. I will. Maybe I'll start writing on Twitter. I don't know, more podcasts. We'll see.
Well, we'll come up with all kinds of ideas and just rope you in. So don't you worry, volunteered now, so you're doomed. But I'm going the other direction. So we've hit on a whole bunch of random things today. But part of what I think is really interesting in your group is that you are combining this processing technology with streaming. And so you're marrying some serious financial scenarios with process technology. And I find that to be really interesting. So can we talk a little bit about why you decided to do it this way and what does that really mean?
Of course. And so to be frank, we have not done a streaming deal. And this is a broader strategy, which won't be action for maybe 12 to 18 months yet, of course. And back to the problem of the economic viability, when you break down a DCF and recovering scandium from a copper mine, gallium from an alumina smelter, alumina refiner, or another PGM from a nickel cobalt SXEW asset. One of the challenges is that even if a new technology, such as the one Kunin has presented, closes the math to make this byproduct now profitable, these big majors don't actually care. And it's tied to the fact that they have an operating asset producing $1.3 billion of copper top line. And this byproduct, although gross profitable, would increase EBIT, is maybe only an incremental $21 million of revenue uplift per annum. In an effort, you can maybe indict the accountants of the world and the pure financial maestros running these large mining companies or even just mid-cap mining companies. You could blame them for wanting to focus on the core iron ore business or core copper business. No one is rashly going to dedicate all the engineering efforts and allocate capital out of their annual or quarterly plan for these such small revenue opportunities. So what this concept of streaming or financing these byproduct projects is attempting to solve for is that even if we put this shiny technology in front of them and proved at a bench scale or pilot scale that you can now profitably produce silver here, gold here, it would be hard to make decision makers take this seriously and want to invest all the effort or move ground at their asset. So there's this pure process economics barrier to adoption, which is getting solved through technology, but also an overarching investability question mark, which is more psychological or at the corporate level. And so you're even seeing with Jakob leaving Rio and now Simon coming in as the new CEO of Rio from his iron ore background, a complete de-emphasis, at least publicly in the media, about some of these critical minerals Rio Tinto had previously been looking at and invested in. Jakob had this slogan of total ore body effectiveness. I think all mines and mining operations should move towards that direction. An ore body can contain 10 to 15 metals, which are potentially recoverable. And you only really see this creativeness at very mature mining assets that are just trying to squeeze a little bit more value out of this. And so case in point, Bingham Canyon in the Kennecott complex or Olympic Dam under BHP. There's actually a bifurcation in this byproduct investment between a lot of Western mining companies or Western operating assets and what you see elsewhere across Kazakhstan, the DRC, Chinese-owned assets. They push a lot more emphasis on the byproducts, and you could argue that comes from CPP in and of itself, which had recognized much earlier than Western economies the importance of these minor metals. And now there's, of course, the ramifications we're seeing with the US and the cutoff of supply and current geopolitical tensions. So what we're trying to do through this streaming is, of course, try to solve and check off every box as to why a mining company would not want to produce some more of these minor metals. And weirdly, we're even seeing that some companies don't even assay some of the streams or assay for some of these minor metals across their asset base. And part of that is they don't know what they don't know. And part of that is they might have assayed it, but don't want to share it with people because they don't have to deal with this bureaucracy of going for these small projects. That's the intention around streaming. And unfortunately, venture capital investors also have a big stick and want to see outsized venture returns. And that's something process technology companies or mining technology companies have often struggled to achieve and return those returns to investors. And so streaming is also potentially very attractive for Kunin's growth and scale, although the core technology itself has application in water treatment, food and beverage, pharmaceutical separation. So I think we're quite comfortable with seeing this end goal of how much value we can create, how many equipment solutions and projects we can service.
That's really cool. So just something that I'm noticing in the market, and let me know if this is something that you're also seeing and looking at for potential areas to partner with companies. With the pricing of gold and copper and other metals at present, and then realizing that some of these tailing piles may have a whole bunch of other stuff in them, we're seeing companies go and essentially remine tailings going back. And we have a group that we've worked with that goes and buys old tailings and then goes to try to process them, because there's a lot more that's recoverable in some of these areas than was traditionally. So is that a target for you in terms of companies that you might want to help, or are they coming to you and saying, hey, we don't know actually what to do with this, can you help us? So on our scale.
A little bit of all of it. So one of the projects we're working on is an operating asset recovering a metal from a raffinate at their SX circuit. There's one project that will be announced, I think, within the next 2 weeks, which is a smelter residue. And then there's all these other projects that we're currently discussing with to start development programs, which are things as random as tailings or another side stream from their process plant. So what we'd like to do is do as many of these projects as we possibly can, because we think the technology over all else is moving it closer to economic investability or viability than what tools they currently have or technologies they currently have. But with the anecdote about gold price being so high or silver pricing skyrocketing, what we're trying to do is be a high tide that lifts all boats regardless of what the low tide was. And so in that respect, I think we're somewhat counter-cyclical what we want to do with the business. But yeah, there's a lot of focus now on care and maintenance assets that might have 20, 30 years of stockpiled tailings or some gangue or some residue or an old raffinate pond or PLS pond that now are changed hands. And yeah, those are certainly very attractive opportunities. From where we want to start with, it's these operating assets, but of course, assets held by a head co, which might have only one or two assets. And so they're willing to take these bets and risks on adopting new technology. Because for them, if we're somehow significantly affecting 20% of their revenue, that's having more outsized returns on their equity value than Rio Tinto, which has maybe 40, 50 billion of revenue, right? For example. So those sorts of mining asset owners are the ideal adopters of mining technology. And all of my peers now across drill and blast software, automation of drill rigs, some AI for exploration, recognize that these smaller companies are the ones who are really going to drive forward innovation. And then there's this funny quote that I hear from mining people, mining entrepreneurs, everyone almost every week, is that mining companies hate to be the first adopter, but love to be the second mover. Yeah. And so you just need one of these deployments or implementations to have the vote of confidence. And as the mining industry operates purely on trust. And so I think overall we're in this time delay period before, hopefully 18 months from now, all these amazing technologies are now being swooped up and broadly deployed across assets.
Well, I have to say that I'm optimistic, but I would tend to err that direction because the opposite just doesn't seem like it would be very good for my mental health. So I'm gonna be optimistic with you, but I'm certainly seeing it. And I really appreciate, I wanted to mention that the goal for you guys is to be countercyclical. And I think in an environment in mining where we ride the highs and then try to weather the lows, it's a really prudent plan to say we can do this and add value across that, the high and the low. And so we're there, whether you're riding the wave or when you're crying in your beer somewhere else. And I just think that we need to think about that more actively as an industry, because when I was watching it at PDAC this year, I'm watching capital deploy to projects, to other technologies, to all kinds of stuff right now. And while that's very encouraging, I still think that we need to stop, be prudent, evaluate what's out there, and deploy capital to things that really, truly deserve it. And watching a few of these cycles in my history, the wheat will get separated from the chaff, so to speak, but it takes some time. And we're still going to see money get deployed into some silly places in the near term. So I'm
boy, have we capital. Yeah, boy, have we seen that in the past 6 to 9 months as well. But yeah, you're right. There's a positive to more non-mining investors now having capital inflows, even to just juniors or majors, as well as technology. But there's a risk that a lot of these investments don't pan out, and there's terrible capital returns to invest in mining process technology or junior assets at the top of the gold cycle that then lead to this even deeper trough in the next down cycle. And mining has always struggled with this commodity super cycles, down cycles. And I don't think that's ever going to change, but there's a significant risk that this kind of venture capital hype or high dies down and then has a negative aggregate effect on maybe the technologies that are working and generating value. And so that's things certainly I worry about, that there's all these timing games that I'm going to have to play with Kunin to make sure we earn what we deserve in terms of capital raising and get our technology deployed at the right time in a cycle. So yeah, it's something that keeps me up at night, and I could maybe get a little disdainful and say there's way too much capital allocating into the mining tech world right now. And I'm frustrated because it's a little bit harder to hire a hydrometallurgist, but I'll digress. I think overall I'm blessed and probably couldn't be building Kunin at any other point in time in history.
I'm super excited to see what's in store, and I think you're doing an amazing job. And with a team of 6, and in spite of the difficulties of hiring a hydrometallurgist,
well, we've got him here today.
I can sympathize. So I'm glad that you have them. I guess let's end on a high note. Looking ahead, what is giving you optimism about not just Kunin, but the future of mining?
I think it's
supposed to take this long to answer.
Not supposed to. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good nondescript answer for you, Lindsey. I would say it's a sum of 10% gains everywhere that we're just beginning to notice. You mentioned a great tsunami of people probably leaving the industry in 10 years for retirement. I think we're seeing a golden tsunami, hopefully, of government turning around in their awareness of this issue and deploying capital, mining investors, asset owners more receptive to adopting technology, and of course, all the young entrepreneurial people and amazing engineers now trying to get in the industry. That's what has me excited. I think it's a sum of all those factors. There's not one particular thing outside of the cool projects we're working on and the traction we have and amazing people we're bringing onto the team that makes me more excited. I can only speak from, I say, the inside of Kunin for to give a truthful answer about what gets me really excited. So on that note, there's a lot of excitement with some of the national labs and the researchers that have spent their whole academic careers here, now starting to see companies willing to push forward, move fast. And I recall an anecdote from another entrepreneur at a conference out in Florida, or an event out in Florida, who's pushing forward some nuclear reactors, some SMRs. And he gave an anecdote about how he had been engaged with C or whatever regulatory commission in the nuclear industry to get their reactor certified. And they approached them and they said, this would be 30 months. And he goes, okay, how about 6 weeks? And they're like, we could do 18 months maybe. And he goes, okay, cool. But how about 6 weeks? And they're like, okay. And then that startup moved as fast as they possibly could, and were able to actually get that done in about 6 to 7 weeks. And the anecdote that this specific startup founder had given was that after that enormous sprint, all of these people that have been working in the NRC in a desk job, sluggishly, in a bureaucratic manner for the past 30 years of their career, were the most satisfied and super excited that they had actually worked hard finally on something and put in an enormous amount of effort. And that's just the human condition. We need to move fast, solve problems quickly to keep ourselves happy and stimulated. And what I'm observing with researchers, startups, is that there's now this urgency that has finally become very prescient, amplified by geopolitical things happening in the Middle East. And with China, that is now giving people the excitement and vigor to, let's say, maximally apply themselves. And that's when I've always been happiest, is working as many hours as I possibly can without losing my mind. And certainly I don't want that quality to ever go away. And so even on a day-to-day basis, I'm most happy when I get the most things done and get closer towards a goal. And so I think everyone now in America is slowly coming around to this unification that mining is important for a country, national security, and economy. And I hope this potentially boils over in 2 years. Not boils over in that it dies down, but that we now have as many people working in mining as there are on AI for social media, right?
I love ending on this note because I think that urgency and enthusiasm and vigor is exactly what we need. And I'm so glad that you're witnessing it and that you thrive in that environment. I tend to work well under pressure as well. And otherwise, I wouldn't be consulting because everybody wants it yesterday, right? I can totally identify with you. And I so appreciate your spending some time with us. And I'm going to take you up on your offer to deploy you as my next ambassador to
I'd be excited.
rile people up for the mining industry. Buckle up.
Send it my way, Lindsey. I'm fast to respond to email. I'm sure you have my cell too. I'd love to go to universities, of course, selfishly to recruit some exceptional students to join Kunin, but I want to be an ambassador for this industry. And I'm also working on my brother, prying him away from BP and commodity, petroleum industry to maybe join Kunin. I'd love to make this a family business in some respects.
Wow. Your sister's on her way. You're going to
on her way.
And then she'll be like, okay, I'm game. So yeah, make it a family business. I come from a family business. It's lots of fun and lots of dysfunction all wrapped up into one thing. And it's wonderful.
And worse. I'll introduce Mary to you, Lindsey, if you're so kind. And
I would love to meet her and whatever I can do to help. So thank you again for your time today, Daniel, and talking about Kunin. And everything will be plugged here. So I'm going to just click my button. So if you guys want to find Kunin and take a peek at the website, here it is. So for those of you listening and not watching, this will be on the podcast link. And so you can find the company. And then here you can find Daniel on his LinkedIn. Take a peek, ask some questions, learn a little bit of something new. And we appreciate you visiting and hanging out with us today. So we'll see you again.
Thanks, Lindsey. And the final shout out, the website could use some improvement. We're working on it. And then if you're a process engineer, hydrometallurgist, bang our line. We will be hiring soon, I believe.
Yes. Please find Daniel. And if you can't find Daniel, find me and I'll send you to Daniel.
And then I'll pay Lindsey a recruiting fee.
Wow. Awesome, guys. Take a peek at it and we'll see you guys on the next episode.